The old piano stood in the corner of the restaurant, its polished surface gleaming under the soft lights. The place was called Romano's, an Italian spot known for its cozy atmosphere and food that made people close their eyes when they took the first bite. It wasn't the kind of place where someone without money would normally step foot, but hunger can make people brave. The man who pushed open the heavy wooden door that evening hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. His coat, once good quality, hung loose on his thin frame. His beard had grown wild, and his eyes, deep-set and tired, darted around the room as he entered. The smell hit him first: garlic bread, pasta sauce, and roasting meats. His stomach cramped painfully, reminding him why he had gathered the courage to come inside. The host, a short man with slicked back hair and a crisp black suit, spotted him immediately. In an upscale restaurant like Romano's, it was the host's job to spot trouble before it reached the paying customers. He moved quickly, cutting off the hungry man's path before he could get more than a few steps inside. "Sir," the host said, his voice hushed but firm, "I'm afraid we're fully booked tonight." His eyes flicked meaningfully to the man's stained pants and worn-out shoes. The hungry man didn't argue or get angry. He had expected this, but he hadn't walked 3 miles in the cold just to be turned away at the door. His gaze drifted past the host, landing on the piano in the corner. "Currently, no one was playing it, I understand," the hungry man said quietly. His voice was surprisingly clear and educated-sounding, which made the host pause. "I'm not here for charity. I was wondering if I might play for my supper." The host's eyebrows shot up and then he laughed. It wasn't a mean laugh exactly, but it wasn't kind either. It was the laugh of someone who had heard every excuse and story there was to hear. "You want to play the piano? For food?" The host shook his head. "Listen, buddy, this isn't some old Western movie. We have professional musicians who play here." The hungry man stood his ground. "Just one song. If the customers don't like it, I'll leave without causing any trouble." The host was about to refuse again when a woman's voice cut through their conversation. "Is there a problem, Tony?" The owner of the voice was a tall woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in an elegant bun. She wore simple but expensive clothes and carried herself with the confidence of someone who was used to being in charge. "No problem, Mrs. P," the host said quickly, "just explaining to this gentleman that we don't need any entertainment tonight." The woman, Mrs. P, looked at the hungry man with clear, assessing eyes. He met her gaze without flinching. "You play?" she asked simply. He nodded. "I do. And you're hungry?" Again, a nod. Mrs. P studied him for a long moment while the host shifted uncomfortably. Then she made a decision. "Our regular pianist is late tonight. You can play until he arrives." She turned to the host. "Tony, show him to the piano." "But Mrs. P," Tony began. "It's my restaurant, Tony," she said, not unkindly but with unmistakable authority. "And I've always believed that music sounds better when it comes from the soul. Hunger has a way of bringing out the soul in people." Tony's mouth snapped shut. He gave a curt nod and gestured for the hungry man to follow him. The restaurant was busy that evening. Every table was filled with well-dressed people enjoying their meals, their conversations creating a pleasant buzz throughout the space. A few glanced up curiously as Tony led the shabby stranger to the piano, but most didn't notice. "One song," Tony hissed as they reached the piano, "and nothing weird or depressing." "This is a classy place," the hungry man just nodded and slid onto the bench. He took a moment to simply touch the piano, running his fingertips lightly over the keys without pressing them. It had been a long time since he'd sat at an instrument this fine. Tony hovered nearby, arms crossed and expression skeptical. From her position near the bar, Mrs. P watched with interest. The hungry man closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and began to play. The first notes were quiet, almost hesitant. A few nearby diners glanced over, some with slight frowns at the interruption. But then the music began to build, gaining confidence and complexity with each measure. His fingers moved across the keys with surprising grace and precision. This wasn't the playing of someone who had picked up a few tunes by ear. This was the playing of someone who had spent thousands of hours mastering the instrument, played a piece that seemed familiar to some in the restaurant, a classical composition that started gently but grew into something powerful and moving. His body swayed slightly with the music and his face transformed. The weariness fell away, replaced by a look of complete absorption. In that moment, he wasn't a homeless man playing for food. He was simply a musician, one with extraordinary talent. Conversations around the restaurant began to fade as more people noticed the music. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Waiters slowed their steps to listen. In the kitchen, the head chef poked his head out to see what had caused the unusual quiet in his dining room. The sous chefs followed, wiping their hands on their aprons as they crowded around the door. The hungry man didn't notice any of this. He was lost in the music, his fingers finding the keys without conscious thought. The piece reached its crescendo, his hands flying across the keyboard with speed and emotion that seemed impossible from someone in his physical state. And then, as the final notes faded, he opened his eyes. The restaurant was completely silent. For one terrible moment, he thought they had hated it, that they were staring at him in disgust or pity, that he had failed in this last desperate attempt to feed himself with dignity. Then the applause began. It started with a single person, Mrs. P herself, and quickly spread throughout the restaurant. People were standing, clapping enthusiastically, some with tears in their eyes. The chef was nodding appreciatively from the kitchen doorway. Even Tony stood with his mouth slightly open, all traces of skepticism gone from his face. The hungry man blinked, overwhelmed by the response. He hadn't expected this. He had hoped for a polite reaction at best, maybe enough appreciation to earn him a simple meal in the kitchen. Mrs. P approached the piano, gesturing for him to remain seated when he started to stand. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice just loud enough for him to hear over the continuing applause. He hesitated. Names had power. His had been in newspapers once and concert programs, but that had been a different life. "Lee," he said finally, giving his middle name rather than the one people had once known him by. "Well, Lee," Mrs. P said, "our regular pianist just called in sick. Would you be interested in playing for the rest of the evening? The pay includes dinner, whatever you'd like from the menu, and cash besides." Before Lee could respond, a well-dressed man from a nearby table approached them. "Excuse me," the man said, addressing Mrs. P but looking at Lee. "I'm with River City Symphony. Would it be possible to speak with—" He trailed off, waiting for an introduction. "This is Lee," Mrs. P provided. "Lee, this is Mr. Reynolds." Mr. Reynolds extended his hand. "That was Rachmaninoff's Prelude in G minor. I've heard professional pianists with 30 years of experience who couldn't play it with the emotion you just did." Lee slowly stood and shook the offered hand. "Thank you," he said simply, uncertain how to respond to such praise after so long. "Do you have formal training?" Mr. Reynolds asked. Lee nodded. "Yes, a long time ago." "Not that long," Mr. Reynolds said with a knowing look. "That kind of technique doesn't disappear even when everything else does." There was no judgment in his voice, just recognition. "I'd like to talk to you about an upcoming project, if you're interested." The murmur of conversation had returned to the restaurant, though many people were still glancing toward the piano with appreciation. The smell of food was heavy in the air, reminding Lee of his original purpose. Mrs. P seemed to read his thoughts. "First things first," she said. "Tony, please take Lee's order and tell the kitchen to make it priority. The best table in the house just opened up." She gestured to a quiet corner with a good view of both the restaurant and the street outside. As Tony led him to the table, Lee felt a strange lightness in his chest. It wasn't just the promise of food or the unexpected praise. It was something he hadn't felt in years, something he'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. He sat at the table, staring at the menu without really seeing it. His fingers still tingled from the feel of the keys. His heart still raced from the music and the applause. One desperate act. One moment of courage when he'd pushed open that door and asked, "Can I play for food?" And suddenly, unexpectedly, the world had answered, yes. Lee couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten food this good. The pasta was perfectly cooked, the sauce rich with tomatoes and herbs, and the bread still warm from the oven. He tried to eat slowly, to savor each bite, but hunger made that difficult. Still, he was careful not to wolf it down. He might look like a man who belonged on the street, but he remembered how to act in places like Romano's. Mrs. P had given him space to eat, but now she returned to his table, carrying a cup of espresso. She placed it in front of him and sat down in the empty chair across from him. "That was quite a performance," she said. "You've made quite an impression on my customers. 3 different tables have asked if you're a regular here. Lee wrapped his hands around the warm cup. Thank you for giving me a chance. I didn't do it out of charity, Mrs. P said, her eyes sharp but not unkind. I did it because I heard something in your voice. A certain dignity. It made me curious. Lee nodded, understanding. He'd held on to his dignity when he'd lost everything else. Some days it felt like the only thing he still owned. Where did you learn to play like that? Mrs. P asked. Lee took a sip of espresso before answering. The rich, bitter taste brought back memories of concert halls and after-parties, of a life that seemed like it belonged to someone else now. Music school, he said simply. A long time ago. Not that long ago, Mrs. P said, echoing what Mr. Reynolds had said earlier. That kind of talent doesn't just disappear. Lee's fingers tapped absently against the table as if playing phantom keys. The talent might stay, but opportunities don't. Mrs. P studied him with the same assessing look she'd given him when he first entered her restaurant. What happened? It was a personal question, the kind that Lee usually avoided. But there was something about Mrs. P that made him want to answer. Maybe it was the meal she'd provided, or the chance to play again, or simply the way she asked without pity in her voice. Life, he said finally. Bad decisions. Worse luck. He paused, deciding how much to share. I had a career once. Concert pianist. I traveled, performed, made good money. His voice grew quieter. Then my wife and daughter died in a car crash while I was on tour. Mrs. P didn't offer empty condolences. She just nodded, letting him continue. I stopped playing after that. Couldn't bear to touch a piano. Started drinking. Lost my house, my savings, my friends. He gave a small, humorless smile. Turns out the music world moves on pretty quickly when you disappear for a few years. And now? Mrs. P asked. Lee shrugged. Now I'm the guy who asks to play for food. Mrs. P leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. My husband was a musician, she said. Jazz trumpeter. He built this place after his hands got too arthritic to play professionally anymore. Said good food and good music came from the same place inside a person. Lee found himself wondering about this woman, about what had brought her to this moment across the table from him. There was a strength to her that reminded him of his late wife. What would your husband think about letting a stranger play his piano? Lee asked. Mrs. P smiled for the first time, a warm expression that transformed her stern face. He'd say I took too long to make the decision. Their conversation was interrupted as Mr. Reynolds approached the table, holding a business card. He placed it in front of Lee. I meant what I said earlier, Mr. Reynolds said. We're doing a special concert series next month. Hidden Talents. The idea is to feature exceptional musicians who aren't currently in the spotlight. After what I heard tonight, I'd like you to consider being part of it. Lee stared at the card, not reaching for it. I haven't performed in public in years, he said. You performed tonight, Mr. Reynolds pointed out. And from what I saw, you've still got the magic. He gestured to the room. Every person in here felt something when you played. That's rare, even among professionals. Lee still didn't touch the card. I don't even have a place to practice. Or proper clothes. Or details, Mrs. P cut in. All solvable problems. Mr. Reynolds nodded. The symphony has practice rooms. And we provide attire for our performers. Lee looked between the two of them, feeling suddenly overwhelmed. The idea of returning to music professionally, even for one concert, seemed impossible. Like something from a dream. I appreciate the offer, he said carefully, but I'm not sure I'm ready. Mr. Reynolds seemed about to argue, but Mrs. P held up a hand to stop him. No pressure, she said to Lee, but take the card anyway. Options are good things to have. Lee hesitated, then picked up the card and slipped it into his coat pocket. Now, Mrs. P continued, about tonight. Our regular pianist isn't coming back. He called to quit while you were eating. Something about a cruise ship gig. So the piano is free for the rest of the evening. You want me to keep playing? Lee asked. If you're willing, Mrs. P said. I'll pay you what I paid him, $150 for the night plus tips. And there's a small room upstairs where staff can rest during breaks. You're welcome to stay there tonight if you need a place. Lee felt a lump form in his throat. One meal would have been enough. This, a whole night of playing, actual pay, a safe place to sleep, was more than he'd dared hope for. I'd be honored, he managed to say. Mrs. P stood. Good, finish your coffee. Take your time. The night crowd is just starting to come in. As she walked away, Lee sat in stunned silence. The restaurant around him hummed with activity. Waiters taking orders, the kitchen sending out steaming plates, customers laughing and talking. It all felt surreal, like he was watching someone else's life. Just that morning, he'd been huddled in a doorway trying to stay out of the wind, wondering if he'd eat that day. And now, his thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Tony, the host who had tried to turn him away earlier. "Mrs. P says you're playing for the rest of the night," Tony said, his earlier hostility replaced by cautious respect. Lee nodded. "The customers have been asking what else you can play," Tony continued. "Do you know any jazz? Pop stuff? Mrs. P likes the classics, but the late crowd usually prefers something more modern." "I know a bit of everything," Lee said, surprising himself with the confidence in his voice. It had been so long since he'd felt confident about anything. Tony nodded, satisfied. "Good, and, I'm sorry about earlier." At the door, Lee waved away the apology. "You were doing your job." "Yeah, but still." Tony hesitated, then added, "That was some playing. Best I've heard in this place, and I've been here 8 years. After Tony left, Lee finished his coffee and made his way back to the piano. The restaurant had filled up even more, with a younger crowd mixing in with the dinner patrons. A few people nodded at him as he passed, recognition in their eyes. As he slid onto the piano bench again, Lee felt different than he had earlier. The desperate edge of hunger was gone, replaced by something else. Not quite confidence, it was too soon for that, but maybe its first seedling. A sense that tonight, at least, he belonged here. He flexed his fingers, thinking about what to play. Something had changed inside him during that meal. During those conversations with Mrs. P and Mr. Reynolds, he wasn't ready to dive back into his old life, wasn't ready to call himself a concert pianist again. But for tonight, he could be a restaurant pianist. It was a start. He began to play a jazz standard, one his wife had loved. His fingers remembered the notes even after all these years. Around him, conversations continued, but he caught people nodding along, smiling, some closing their eyes to better appreciate the music. For the next 3 hours, Lee played everything from classical pieces to jazz standards to recent pop songs that he'd heard on radios as he passed by shops. Each time he finished a piece, there was applause. People left tips in the jar that Tony had placed on top of the piano. A few came up to make requests. For the first time in years, Lee felt like himself again. Not the broken man who had been sleeping on park benches. Not the bitter ex-musician who had thrown away his career. Just Lee. A man who could make beautiful sounds come from a piano. When the last customer finally left around midnight, Lee's fingers were sore, but his heart felt lighter than it had in years. Mrs. P brought him a final cup of coffee and a plate of tiramisu. "You've earned this," she said, placing them beside him on the piano bench, "and a good night's rest. Tony will show you to the room when you're ready." Lee looked up at her, trying to find the right words to express what this night had meant to him. But all he could manage was a simple, heartfelt, "Thank you." Mrs. P smiled. "Thank you for the music. It's been too long since this place really came alive." She turned to go, then stopped. "The piano will be here tomorrow if you want to come back." As she walked away, Lee sat alone with his coffee and dessert, the quiet restaurant around him, and the possibility of tomorrow hanging in the air like a note waiting to be played. Lee woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar curtains. For a moment, he felt the familiar panic of not knowing where he was. Then the memories of the previous night flooded back. The piano, the applause, the unexpected kindness. He sat up on the small cot in Romano's staff room. His coat hung neatly on a hook by the door, cleaner than it had been in months. Someone must have taken it while he slept. On a chair beside the bed were folded clothes that weren't his, dark pants and a button-up shirt that looked about his size. A note rested on top. "Thought you might need these. Coffee's ready downstairs." Mrs. P. Lee ran a hand through his beard, feeling suddenly self-conscious about his appearance in a way he hadn't in a long time. When you're worried about your next meal, things like shaving become unimportant. But now, the staff room had a tiny bathroom attached. Lee found it stocked with basic toiletries, soap, shampoo, a disposable razor. Another of Mrs. P's thoughtful touches. 40 minutes later, he emerged downstairs looking like a different man. Clean-shaven, hair washed and combed, wearing the borrowed clothes that fit surprisingly well. The restaurant was quiet in the morning light, chairs still stacked on tables from the night before. Mrs. P sat at the bar, going through receipts with a cup of coffee at her elbow. She looked up when she heard his footsteps. "Well," she said, eyebrows raised. "There you are." Lee touched his smooth chin self-consciously. "Thank you for the clothes. And everything else." She waved away his thanks. "The clothes belonged to our old busboy. He left them behind when he moved. They were just gathering dust." She poured a cup of coffee from the pot beside her and pushed it across the bar toward him.
"Sleep well?"
"Better than I have in months," Lee admitted, taking the coffee gratefully. "Good." She returned to her receipts. "Kitchen opens at 11. You're welcome to stay and have lunch before you go." The words hung in the air between them. Before you go. A gentle reminder that last night's kindness had an end point. Lee understood. Mrs. P had already done more than most would. "About that," he said, choosing his words carefully. "You mentioned the piano would still be here today." Mrs. P looked up, a glint in her eye. "I did. I was wondering if maybe you might need a piano player for another night?" Mrs. P closed her receipt book. "As a matter of fact, I do. Our previous pianist quit, remember? That position is open." Hope flickered in Lee's chest, but he tempered it with caution. "I don't have a place to live right now, or many clothes, or a phone number where you could reach me." "All solvable problems," Mrs. P said, echoing her words from the night before. "The staff room isn't meant as a permanent residence, but it's yours until you find something better. As for clothes," she gestured at what he was wearing, "you clean up nice, and Romano's has a casual dress code anyway. And phones?" She pulled an old flip phone from her pocket. "My spare. It's got my number programmed in it." Lee stared at the items she was offering, not just things, but lifelines. "Why are you doing all this for me?" Mrs. P was quiet for a moment, turning her coffee cup in her hands. "My husband, the one who built this place, was a lot like you once. Talented musician who hit rock bottom, lost everything to addiction after his career fell apart." She looked up, meeting Lee's eyes. "Someone gave him a second chance. Hired him to play in their restaurant. He got clean, saved some money, eventually opened this place. And now you're paying it forward," Lee said softly. Mrs. P nodded. "Life's full of circles like that. Besides," she added with a hint of a smile, "you brought in more customers last night than we've had in weeks. I know a good business decision when I see one." The front door chimed, and they both turned to see a delivery man with an armful of fresh flowers for the restaurant tables. Mrs. P stood to deal with him, pausing briefly to squeeze Lee's shoulder as she passed. The gesture was small but carried the weight of understanding between two people who had known loss. While Mrs. P signed for the flowers, Lee wandered over to the piano. In the daylight, he could see details he'd missed the night before. Small scratches on its surface, a worn spot on the bench, the slightly yellowed keys that spoke of years of use and love. He sat down and placed his hands on the keys, not playing yet, just feeling their cool smoothness beneath his fingertips. When was the last time he'd played sober in the morning light? 5 years ago, 6? He began to play softly, a piece he'd composed himself back when music was still the center of his world. It was a simple melody that had come to him while watching his daughter play in Autumn Leaves. The memory brought pain, but for the first time in years, it brought something else too, a bittersweet joy that she had existed at all, that he had been lucky enough to be her father for the brief time she was here. Lost in the music, he didn't notice Mr. Reynolds enter the restaurant until the man was standing beside the piano. "I came back to hear if last night was a fluke," Mr. Reynolds said when Lee stopped playing, startled by his presence. "It wasn't." Lee nodded in greeting but didn't speak. "That piece," Mr. Reynolds continued, "I don't recognize it." "You wouldn't," Lee said. "I wrote it." Mr. Reynolds' eyebrows rose. "You compose as well?" "I used to." Lee ran his fingers lightly over the keys without pressing them down. "Haven't written anything new in a long time." "Well, this changes things," Mr. Reynolds said, excitement creeping into his voice. "Our Hidden Talents concert series. What if you performed your own compositions? Original works from a rediscovered composer." The idea sent a jolt of both terror and excitement through Lee. "I don't know if I'm ready for that." 2 weeks, Mr. Reynolds said. "That's how long until the first concert?" "Plenty of time to prepare." He pulled a folded paper from his pocket and handed it to Lee. "This is the formal invitation. There's a stipend involved. Not much, but enough to help you get back on your feet. An exposure that could lead to other opportunities." Lee took the paper but didn't open it. "I appreciate the offer, but Sleep on it, Mr. Reynolds suggested. Talk it over with Mrs. P. I think she's got good instincts about these things. Before Lee could respond, the delivery man left and Mrs. P returned. Trying to steal my new pianist already? She asked Mr. Reynolds with a knowing look. Not steal, Mr. Reynolds said. Borrow, for a good cause. Mrs. P turned to Lee. The Symphony Hall is less than a mile from here. You could easily do both. Play there for their special concert and still work here in the evenings. Lee looked between them, feeling oddly like a child whose parents were planning his future. Except these weren't his parents, just strangers who had, for reasons he still didn't fully understand, decided to believe in him. I haven't said yes to either job yet, he reminded them. Mrs. P crossed her arms. Are you planning to say no? Lee looked down at the piano keys, considering. He could walk away right now. Go back to the streets, to the struggle of day-to-day survival. Back to a life where no one expected anything from him. Or he could stay. Accept the help being offered. Try to rebuild something from the wreckage of his old life. No, he said finally. I'm not planning to say no. Mrs. P nodded, satisfied. Then it's settled. You start officially tonight as Romano's new pianist. And, she looked to Mr. Reynolds, he'll think about your concert. Mr. Reynolds beamed. Excellent. I'll leave you two to work out the details. Lee, my number's on that invitation. Call me when you've decided, but don't wait too long. We need to start rehearsals soon. After he left, Lee and Mrs. P sat in companionable silence for a moment. You don't have to do the concert if you're not ready, Mrs. P said eventually, but I think it would be good for you. Lee nodded, still processing the rapid changes in his life. A week ago I was sleeping under a bridge, he said quietly. Now I'm being offered a job and a concert opportunity. Life can change fast, Mrs. P said. In both directions. There was knowledge in her voice that spoke of personal experience with both the highs and lows. What if I mess this up? Lee asked, voicing his deepest fear. What if I can't handle it and end up back where I started? Mrs. P considered him for a long moment. Then you'll find another piano to play at. Another door to knock on. The world has a lot of doors, Lee. She stood up and began taking chairs down from tables, preparing for the day's business. Now how about some breakfast? Cook just got in and makes the best omelets in town. As Lee helped her with the chairs, he felt something shifting inside him, like puzzle pieces falling into place after being scattered for years. He wasn't fixed. His grief wasn't gone. The damage he'd done to his life wouldn't be repaired overnight. But for the first time in a very long time, he was moving forward instead of standing still. And that, he thought as sunlight streamed through Romano's windows, was something worth playing for. 2 weeks passed in a blur for Lee. Each night, he played at Romano's, filling the restaurant with music that drew increasing crowds. Word had spread about the homeless pianist who played like a concert master. People came just to hear him, ordering dinner so they could stay for his performance. During the days, Lee found himself at the Symphony Hall, practicing for the upcoming Hidden Talents concert. Mr. Reynolds had been thrilled when Lee finally called to accept his offer. Now, with just 1 day left before the performance, Lee sat alone in a practice room, staring at sheet music, his own compositions that he hadn't looked at in years. The door opened, and a woman peeked in. Lee recognized her as one of the violinists who would be accompanying him tomorrow night. Sorry to interrupt, she said. Just wanted to check if we're still on for the final rehearsal at 4? Lee nodded, trying to ignore the butterflies in his stomach. I'll be there. She lingered in the doorway. Can I ask you something? Sure. Why did you stop performing? Mr. Reynolds told us a little about your background, how you were on track to be one of the greats. What happened? It was a question Lee had been asked several times over the past 2 weeks. By musicians, by reporters doing preview pieces on the concert, by curious customers at Romano's. He'd gotten better at answering it, finding the balance between honesty and privacy. I lost my family, he said simply, and with them I lost my way. The violinist nodded, seeming to understand that was all the answer she would get. Well, I'm glad you found your way back. Your music it makes people feel things. That's rare. After she left, Lee returned to his practice, but his mind kept wandering to her words. Was this really him finding his way back? Or just a temporary detour before he ended up lost again? The past 2 weeks had been good, better than good. He'd moved out of Romano's staff room and into a small apartment that Mr. Reynolds had helped him find. close enough to both the restaurant and symphony hall that he could walk to work. He'd opened a bank account for his HOA. Ages. He'd even called his sister, who he hadn't spoken to in years, to tell her about the concert. But beneath all these positive changes, Lee still felt the pull of his old demons. The liquor store he passed on his way to work each day. The crushing weight of grief that still ambushed him at unexpected moments. The fear that he didn't deserve this second chance. He was so absorbed in these thoughts that he didn't hear the practice room door open again. "There you are." Mrs. P's voice broke through his reverie. "Tony said you left in a hurry last night. Everything okay?" Lee looked up, surprised to see her in the symphony hall. "What are you doing here?" "Delivering your shirt," she said, holding up a garment bag. "You left it at the restaurant. Figured you might need it for tomorrow." Lee took the bag gratefully. It contained his one good shirt, which Mrs. P had insisted on buying him for the concert. "Thanks, I've been a bit distracted." Mrs. P pulled up a chair beside the piano. In the 2 weeks since their first encounter, she'd become something of a mentor to Lee. Tough but fair, pushing him when he needed it, giving him space when he didn't. "Pre-concert jitters?" she asked. "Something like that." Lee closed the sheet music in front of him. "I keep waiting for all this to fall apart. For someone to realize I don't belong here." "Ah," Mrs. P nodded knowingly. "The old 'I'm a fraud' fear. My husband used to get that before big shows too." "It's not just that," Lee admitted. "Yesterday a woman recognized me after my shift at Romano's. She'd seen me before, not playing piano but panhandling outside the grocery store where she works." He swallowed hard. The look on her face, like she couldn't believe it was the same person. "And that bothered you?" "It reminded me how quickly things can change. How easily I could end up back there." Mrs. P was quiet for a moment, considering his words. "You know what I think? I think you're afraid of success more than failure." Lee frowned. "What do you mean?" "Failure is familiar to you now. You've been living with it for years. But success?" She gestured at the practice room, the piano, the sheet music. "Success means responsibility, expectations, people counting on you." The words hit uncomfortably close to home. "I let people down before," Lee said quietly. "My wife, my daughter. I was on tour when they died. I chose my career over being there for them." It was the first time he'd shared this particular piece of guilt with anyone since the accident. The words hung heavy in the air between them. Mrs. P didn't rush to offer empty reassurances. "That's a heavy burden to carry," she said finally. "But punishing yourself hasn't brought them back. And it hasn't honored their memory either." Lee felt a flicker of defensiveness. "You don't know what they would have wanted." "No," Mrs. P agreed. "But I know what most people want for those they love. They want them to live well, to be happy, to share their gifts with the world." She nodded toward the piano. "Your family loved your music, didn't they?" "My daughter used to fall asleep to it," Lee said, the memory both sweet and painful. "My wife said it was what made her fall in love with me." "Then maybe this," Mrs. P gestured to the sheet music, "isn't betraying them. Maybe it's the most faithful thing you can do." Lee sat with her words, letting them sink in. Could it be that simple? Not simple to do, perhaps, but simple to understand. "The concert tomorrow," he said slowly. "I'm playing 3 pieces, all ones I wrote for them." Mrs. P smiled. "Then they'll be there with you on that stage." The practice room door opened again and Mr. Reynolds stuck his head in. "Oh good, you found him," he said to Mrs. P. "Lee, we need to run through the program order one more time before the final rehearsal." "I'll leave you to it," Mrs. P said, standing. 7 o'clock tomorrow, right? I've got a table reserved for the after-party at Romano's. The whole symphony is invited." After she left, Mr. Reynolds sat down where she had been. "Everything all right? You seemed deep in conversation." "Just sorting some things out," Lee said, feeling somehow lighter than he had all day. "About tomorrow night." Getting nervous?" "That's natural. It's been a while since you performed on a real stage." Lee shook his head. "Not nervous. At least not in the way you think." He looked down at his hands, the hands that had once been his pride, then his burden, and were now, perhaps, his redemption. "I think I'm finally ready to play again." "Really play?" Mr. Reynolds beamed. "That's what I've been waiting to hear." Now about tomorrow's program. As they discussed the final details, Lee felt a clarity he hadn't experienced in years. Mrs. P was right. Success was scarier than failure in many ways. It meant living up to potential, accepting praise, believing you deserved good things. After years of punishing himself, these were foreign concepts. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to learn them again. The next evening arrived with a buzz of excitement in the air. The Hidden Talents concert had sold out after a local news station ran a feature on Lee's story. Backstage, Lee peered through the curtain at the packed hall, his heart pounding. He was dressed in clothes that would have been familiar to his former self but felt strange to the man he'd become. A simple black suit, crisp white shirt, polished shoes. His hair was neatly combed, his face clean-shaven. He looked like the concert pianist he had once been, but inside, he felt like someone new, someone carrying both his grief and his talent, his past and his possible future. 5 minutes, the stage manager called. Lee took a deep breath and pulled the worn photograph from his pocket. His wife and daughter, smiling at a picnic, unaware that their lives would be cut short just weeks after it was taken. He'd carried this photo through homeless shelters and park benches, keeping it safe when he had nothing else. "I'm playing for you tonight," he whispered to their faces. "I hope you can hear it wherever you are." He tucked the photo back into his pocket, right above his heart. From the other side of the curtain, he heard Mr. Reynolds introducing him, telling the audience about finding him playing for his supper at a local restaurant, about the remarkable talent that had been hidden away for years. And then his name was announced, and it was time to step into the light. As Lee walked onto the stage, the applause washing over him, he caught sight of Mrs. P in the front row, giving him an encouraging nod. Beside her sat his sister, who he hadn't seen in 5 years until yesterday, when she'd arrived for the concert with forgiveness in her eyes. Lee sat at the piano, adjusted the bench, and placed his hands on the keys. He was home. The moment Lee's fingers touched the keys, the world around him faded away. There was no audience, no stage, no spotlight, just him and the music waiting to be released. He began with the first piece, a gentle melody he had written when his daughter was born. The notes rose and fell like a lullaby, telling the story of new life and boundless love. As he played, memories washed over him, tiny fingers gripping his thumb, first steps across their living room floor, bedtime stories read by lamplight. But unlike before, when these memories brought only pain, tonight they carried something different: joy, gratitude, the precious gift of having been a father, even if for too short a time. The audience sat spellbound. Many had come out of curiosity, drawn by the human interest story of a homeless man turned concert pianist. But what held them now was the pure emotion flowing from the stage. This wasn't just technically impressive playing. This was music that spoke directly to the heart. Lee transitioned to his second piece without pause. This one was more complex, written during the early years of his marriage. It captured the dance of two lives intertwining, with melodies that chased and complemented each other, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in counterpoint, but always returning to each other. As his hands moved across the keys, Lee felt a presence beside him, almost as if his wife were there, smiling at him the way she used to when he played for her at home. Not a ghost, not a hallucination, but a warmth that filled the empty space he'd carried inside for so long. In the audience, Mrs. P watched with tears in her eyes. She'd heard Lee play many times over the past 2 weeks, but never like this. This wasn't a man playing to earn a meal or even to entertain restaurant patrons. This was an artist bearing his soul through his music, inviting listeners to feel what he felt, to understand what words could never express. Beside her, Lee's sister clutched a program book, her knuckles white. Their reunion yesterday had been awkward at first, years of silence and misunderstanding standing between them. But as they talked, walls had begun to crumble. "I didn't know how to help you," she had confessed. "You pushed everyone away after the accident." "I know," Lee had replied. "I didn't want to be helped. I wanted to disappear." And now, he had thought about it for a long moment before answering. "Now I think maybe I was wrong. About a lot of things." On stage, Lee finished the second piece and paused, looking out at the audience for the first time since he'd begun playing. The hall was utterly silent. Hundreds of people holding their breath, waiting. "The last piece I'll play tonight," Lee said, his voice steady despite the emotion churning inside him, "is called After Rain. I wrote it recently for those who gave me a second chance." This wasn't entirely true. He had started composing this piece years ago, in the dark days after losing his family, but could never finish it. It had remained incomplete like so much else in his life, until last night when he sat at the piano in Romano's after closing time and finally found the ending it needed. He began to play, and the music that filled the concert hall was unlike anything the audience had heard before. It started in sorrow, deep, resonant chords that spoke of loss and grief. But slowly, note by note, something new emerged from the darkness. Not happiness exactly, but resilience. The melody found its way through the pain like water finding a path through stone. As he reached the new ending he'd composed just hours ago, Lee felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. The final chords weren't triumphant or resolved. Life rarely offered such neat conclusions, but they held promise. The promise of dawn after the longest night, of growth after the harshest winter. The last note hung in the air for a breath, and then the audience erupted. They rose to their feet as one, applause thundering through the hall. Lee stood momentarily overwhelmed by the response and bowed. As he straightened, his gaze found Mrs. P in the front row. She nodded once, a gesture that said more than words ever could. "I knew you could do this. I believed in you when you couldn't believe in yourself." Backstage after the fourth curtain call, Lee found himself surrounded by well-wishers, musicians from the symphony, reporters eager for interviews, audience members who had connections to record labels or music schools. Mr. Reynolds pushed through the crowd, beaming. "Phenomenal. Simply phenomenal. I've already had 3 calls about featuring you in other concerts, and a music professor from the university wants to discuss a residency." Lee smiled, grateful but distracted. Over Mr. Reynolds' shoulder, he caught sight of his sister waiting patiently at the edge of the crowd. "Can we talk about all that tomorrow?" he asked. "There's somewhere I need to be." 20 minutes later, Lee, his sister, and Mrs. P walked through the doors of Romano's restaurant. The staff had prepared for this moment. Tables pushed back to create a space for mingling, the bar stocked for celebration, the piano positioned as the centerpiece of the room. As the rest of the symphony members filed in behind them, the restaurant filled with a buzz of conversation and laughter. Lee found himself at the center of it all, accepting congratulations, answering questions about his music, reconnecting with people from his past life who had heard about his performance. In a quiet moment, he slipped away to the bar where Tony was pouring champagne. "Quite a change from 2 weeks ago, huh?" Tony said, sliding a glass toward him. "When you first walked in here asking to play for food." Lee picked up the glass but didn't drink. "Sometimes I still can't believe it." "Believe it," Tony said. "You earned it. Not just with your talent, but with your courage. Takes guts to ask for a second chance." Later, as the party wound down, Lee found himself alone at the piano once more. Most of the guests had left, including Mr. Reynolds, who had departed with promises of meetings and opportunities to discuss in the morning. Mrs. P was in the kitchen, thanking her staff for their hard work. Lee's sister had gone to check into her hotel, planning to stay in town for a few days to spend time with her brother. Lee's fingers moved idly over the keys, not really playing, just feeling the familiar texture beneath his fingertips. This was where it had all started, his journey back from the edge. This piano, this restaurant, a desperate request. "Can I play for food?" He heard footsteps and looked up to see a young man, barely 20, hovering uncertainly nearby. The kid was thin, with the hollow-eyed look of someone who hadn't eaten properly in days. He wore a tattered jacket despite the warm evening. "Sorry to bother you," the young man said, his voice barely audible. Someone told me about you. About what happened here. How you were." He gestured vaguely at his own disheveled appearance. Lee nodded, understanding what the young man couldn't quite say. "I was homeless," he confirmed. "Until 2 weeks ago." Relief flickered across the young man's face at Lee's directness. "I play too," he said. "Guitar, not piano. Used to be in a band before." He trailed off again. "Before life happened?" Lee suggested gently, a nod. "Yeah." Lee studied the young man, seeing echoes of himself, the pride warring with desperation, the talent with no outlet, the past too painful to discuss. "Have you eaten today?" Lee asked, a hesitation, then a small shake of the head. Lee stood up from the piano bench. "Come on, kitchen's still open. Let's get you some food and you can tell me about your music." As they walked toward the kitchen, Lee felt a circle completing itself, the one Mrs. P had spoken about weeks ago. Life's full of circles like that. Someone who had been helped now helping another. Behind the bar, Mrs. P watched them go, a small smile playing on her lips. She'd seen the young man come in, had recognized the look in his eyes. The same look Lee had worn that first night. She'd been about to approach him herself, but Lee had beaten her to it. Outside, a gentle rain began to fall, drumming softly on the restaurant's roof. Inside, the piano stood silent for now, but not abandoned. Never again abandoned. And somewhere in the space between musical notes and the pause between heartbeats, Lee felt his wife and daughter smiling. Not gone, just waiting. Not lost, just transformed, like his grief into music, his despair into hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The spotlight that had found him again would bring expectations and pressures. The path ahead wasn't guaranteed to be smooth, but tonight, in this moment, watching the young guitarist eat his first good meal in days, Lee knew one thing for certain. He was exactly where he was supposed to be, playing it forward one note at a time.